A thanks to Holden Green, our resident Persona expert and reasonably new writer to the channel and longtime pal, for writing this review. Needless to say, he knows the genre inside out and will do it far more justice than I could. Atlus and Sega have finally started to see sense. After years and years of begging and requests, the Nintendo Switch has gone full Persona. We had 5 last year, but now we've got 4 and the topic of today's video, Persona 3. Number 3 is widely considered to be a revitalization of the Persona series, pulled out of obscurity to become one of the most stylish and critically acclaimed JRPG series of all time. This is the game where that really started, and today we're going to find out if it stood the test of time. Firstly, a bit of background. The version released on the Nintendo Switch is Persona 3 Portable. This is actually quite a bit different from the original PlayStation 2 release. This is a port of the PSP version, which first released in Japan in 2009, before getting a Western release a bit later. Now, if you've played the PS2 version, you'll be very surprised about what this PSP version has to offer, as it's quite a different beast. But out of the two, is this my personal favourite? Ooh, well, let's find out. The story of Persona 3 is a dark one. It still retains the gothic undertones the series was known for before becoming super bright and colourful in the latter games. And here you're a new student recently transferred to a high school. So far, so standard JRPG, but it's at this point that things get weird for our protagonist as they find out about the Dark Hour, a period of time that takes place between one day and the next. A sort of limbo period after midnight where people are transformed into coffins, and the only people who remain human during that time are a few special students who can summon personas to combat the Dark Hour. Now obviously you have this ability and you're recruited into SEES, S-E-E-S, a band of students who are the same as you and are trying to investigate the Dark Hour and Tartarus, a huge tower that takes the place of your school, filled with hundreds of randomly generated floors, jam-packed with shadows, monsters, and other cretins that are threatening to envelop the real world. As you'd expect, narrative plays a massive role, and as you get closer to unraveling the truth behind the Dark Hour, you'll find yourself having a brilliant time with the story. Like most of the games in the series, it's a bit of a slow burn and takes a couple of hours to really get going, and once it does, you're in for a bit of a treat. While perhaps not being the best in the series in my opinion, I can see why some fans do feel that way. There's no doubt it's still a brilliant story when compared to most other JRPGs out there. Now the portable version does miss some of the impact of the original release, since now the storytelling is almost in line with visual novels. You just have character sprites and text boxes. That takes a little bit away from it, as a little of the world building's lost there, but not much. And you'll notice that there's a new protagonist in the PSP version. They added in a female protagonist, which you can select at the beginning of the game, and as you can imagine, it changes quite a lot of the story elements. It's a big enough reason alone to pick this version up over the previous releases. It's almost like having a second game. Now the gameplay is rather similar to Persona 4 Golden, if you watched that review, albeit they came out about the same time. I'd hate to repeat myself, but it's worth noting that Persona 3 Portable released 1 year after Persona 4, and between the base version of both of the games, the developers wanted to take some aspects over to the upcoming PSP release. This means that 2 games that were already rather similar in terms of gameplay were made even closer. You will still be doing 2 major things though: managing your daily life and social links with your friends, and then delving into the dungeon to deal with the shadows. The former's been somewhat streamlined in the portable version. There's now no overworld to walk around in. Instead, it's been replaced by a menu system which works and saves the player's time. But as I said, it does take some world building away. When you're in this portion of the game, you find your mates and try to improve your relationships with them. Unlike Persona 4, here your social links are based around groups rather than individuals. The swimming team, your friend circle, the SEES group, the friends you make in the MMO you play, etc. Making time for each of these is essential to unlocking the true power of the personas, which you obviously need for the fights. And you also have to balance your own personal qualities. Surviving in high school is tough, even if you're a midnight demon hunter, and our hero suffers the same teenager social stigmas as anyone else, having 3 stats as well dedicated to academics, charm and courage. And alongside dungeon crawling and social linking, you also have to learn how to be smart, brave and handsome, spending time studying in the library, watching movies, and even doing some good old karaoke, which sadly you can't witness. These sorts of things are essential for getting even further in your social standings. Do well in your midterms and you'll become even more popular. Some girls may even take notice of you. It's all a huge balancing act. because there's not a whole lot of time to do everything. With more things to do than time available, choices must be made. Now, the other part of the game involves Tartarus. During the dark hour, the school transforms into a giant dungeon with hundreds of randomly generated floors. You have to delve in here when you have time and battle the monsters. Your progress is plot blocked, meaning you can only go so high until the story dictates that you'll be able to go further, but it is absolutely huge. Now, in this portable version of Persona 3, the battle system has been tweaked. Now it's more like Persona 4, where you can take control of individual allies rather than relying on the computer to do their actions. Personally, although that sounds weird and uncomfortable to someone who hasn't played it, the AI always did a remarkable job of choosing the best options available. You could always rely on them to heal you at the perfect time, use the best attacks available, and all round be more clever than the idiot playing the game. Or perhaps that was just me. By default, the AI still controls them in the portable version, but in the options wheel you can now set them to be controlled by the player, if you so choose. Combat's all about exploiting the weaknesses of your enemy. Most monsters are weak to a certain element or type of attack, maybe ice, fire, electric or wind. If you can find these, then the enemy will get knocked down, and this allows you to have one more attack. If you manage to knock down all the enemies in one round, which is very possible, you can then initiate an all-out attack from the entire team, and it's what you'll be aiming for. While all the other characters have their persona set in stone, the main protagonist can change theirs, firstly attaining them via cards after winning a battle, and then later by fusing them together to create new ones. Due to the way the leveling system and special attacks work, you're always having to evolve and change these. Even ones you get attached to need to be shoved off to make sure you can keep up with the increasing toughness of the enemies you'll be facing. I believe there are almost 200 personas in the game, so there's an added layer of trying to collect them all. A bit like, I can't remember now. The battling system's great, and even fighting the normal grunts is a lot of fun. The game only really suffers from the dungeon being rather boring and a little repetitive. It's a huge tower that does change the further you go up, but due to the randomized nature, the floors are often made up of the same stock pieces. Normally in a JRPG, that could be a killer blow, but thankfully Persona 3 is a machine with many different facets, and it overcomes that flaw quite easily. It certainly won't be your overarching feeling when you leave the game. In terms of story and gameplay combined, Persona 3 does itself proud and scores 18 out of 20. The controls are as you'd expect. Menus are quite snappy, there's no delay in selecting things during battle, everything responds and is where you'd expect it to be, and navigating the dungeons is reasonably effortless, with minor grievances about the hit detection on trying to swipe at the enemy shadows before battle. To me, this just seemed a little bit delayed and not particularly generous with its reach, but aside from that, the only other control issue that I've had was that there's been no effort to implement touch controls on the overworld. Every time I played handheld, it seemed perfect for tapping the screen rather than moving the cursor with the analog stick. Still, overall I would give the controls 18 out of 20. If there's one thing you can say about the Persona series, is that it oozes style. And Persona 3 is where that really started to take off. From the introduction, animation, the CGs, the Persona designs, and the slight edginess to proceedings, it has a real flair. In comparison to other games of the time, and even to Persona 4, it has a slightly more quaint feeling to it. Character models are vintage, shall we say? It definitely feels like a PSP game, but the style wins it over for the most part. All the 3D sections pop off the screen really well in full HD, as can be said for the character artwork, and any good visual novel would be proud to have this level of quality character sprites within their game. The issue for me comes in the backgrounds and the overworld menu. Whether looking around the school, popping into the pharmacy or the police station, you can't help but suck in a bit of air at the quality of the JPEG backgrounds. Stretched over a big TV hasn't been very kind to them. In portable mode it works fine, and that's probably the best way to play, honestly. As for the performance, it runs smoothly in both docked and handheld mode, and I haven't experienced any crashes. It's not a game that you'll really be worrying about frame rates, and everything remains nice and smooth. For me, the visuals and performance score 15 out of 20. The soundtrack goes hand in hand with the style I mentioned. In terms of music in JRPGs, since Persona 3, this series has always been top tier. It's hard to talk about the music in Persona without sounding like an old fart, because it's genuinely too cool for me to describe why it works so well. The mixture of vocalized, upbeat music within the battles and dungeons is always juxtaposed with something you almost don't expect. Perhaps it doesn't quite hit its ultimate stride until Persona 4, but it's still excellent, and one you'll easily enjoy outside of the game. It's worth noting that most major cutscenes are voiced, both in Japanese and English, with both sets of actors doing a very good job. Of course there are a few questionable voices, but what JRPG doesn't have them. For me, audio scores 19 out of 20. Now for value, Persona 3 Portable is going to set you back $20 in the US and £17.99 here in the UK. For me, that's incredible value for such an enormous game. If you don't play this over 100 hours, then you might be doing it slightly wrong. That's just how long it will be to see what the game truly has to offer. Even if you're just going for the most basic of runs, you'll be saying goodbye to 70 hours of your time. 70 hours of quality story, character development, world building, and monster battling. Sadly, this is only available digitally. There's been no mention about a physical release, but for this price, you can't really say no. You can't even buy the PSP version for that, and if you need value for money in a JRPG on the Switch, then, well, get Persona 4 first, and then get this. Honestly, buying the digital bundle with both games is the way to go, but even just on its own, value still has to get 20 out of 20. Don't forget to watch the Persona 4 review so you can see which one you prefer, in terms of the game that is. But for Persona 3 Portable on the Nintendo Switch, it gets a SwitchUp score of 90 out of 100. It's an exceptional JRPG. It was one of the best on the PS2, one of the best on the PSP, and yeah, you guessed it, it's now one of the best on the Switch. The visuals don't quite hold up to today's standards, and yes, some of the gameplay elements, as we've seen in fairness with a lot of the Persona games, can get a touch repetitive. It's the tying together of the meticulous combat system, the excellent social elements, and the brilliant story that makes Persona so special. We highly recommend you pick them both up. Thanks to Holden, nice one, really enjoyed that. As someone who is still working their way through Persona 5, it's funny to see how many of the systems have evolved and ended up in Persona 5 in a slightly tweaked version. Let him know in the comments how you thought he did, and as always, a big thanks to all of you. Make sure you save 10% in the month of January using code SwitchUp over at switchup.gg to buy your eShop credit. I'm not sure what that would make the value, 21 out of 20, but other than that, for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch Up. Cheers guys, see ya!